It was a pink dress, A-line, pearl buttons, a little Peter Pan collar, the kind of thing you photograph and post and forget by dinner. My daughter held it against her chest and spun once, grinning. Then she stopped. Her thumb caught on something stitched inside the collar, and her whole face changed. "Mommy," she said, "what's this?" I crossed the room and turned the fabric over in my hands. White thread, neat cursive, a name sewn into the inside of the collar like a label. It wasn't her name. I'm a forensic accountant. I read other people's books for a living, and find the dollar they hoped nobody would notice. My hands don't shake. They shook then, because I understood, in the time it takes a heart to skip, that this wasn't a warehouse mix-up. Somebody had typed a name into a box and hit confirm, and it wasn't my daughter's. By the next morning, my parents had called me 11 times. They had no idea the dress was the smallest thing I was about to find. My name is Myra. I'm 34, a CPA in Virginia, married to a man named Daniel who builds kitchens and never raises his voice. We have one child, Lily, 8 years old, a head taller than her class, the kind of kid who labels her rock collection in masking tape and keeps it in an egg carton under the bed. She's the best thing I've ever done. I grew up in a house with 2 daughters and exactly one favorite. My sister Emily is 3 years older than me, and in my mother's eyes the sun came up because Emily smiled at it. Emily got what she wanted by asking. I got what I needed by submitting a case. When I was 14 and needed new soccer cleats, my mother, Carol, made me write 3 paragraphs explaining why I deserved them. She read it at the kitchen table, crossed out a line, and said she'd think about it. Emily got a new phone that same week. No essay required, so I stopped asking. I got a job at 15, opened my own checking account at 16, and paid for my own license working nights at a tax office that smelled like burnt coffee. I learned to be useful. I learned that being indispensable felt almost like being loved, and I told myself the difference didn't matter. My father, Roger, a retired electrician with a bad heart, loved us both. I think, but he loved my mother more than he loved being fair. So he watched from his recliner and said nothing. 3 years ago, Emily detonated. She'd spent her 20s burning through boyfriends, business ideas, and other people's money, maxed my parents' credit card, drained $15,000 from their retirement, abandoned a lease my father co-signed. Then one Tuesday she sent my mother a 3-word text, "Don't look for me," and vanished. My mother was gutted, so I did what I always did. I set up autopay, $1,200 a month toward their mortgage, $400 for my father's supplemental heart insurance, the family phone plan, and every few months an extra, a water heater, a copay, a property tax panic. "Your father's heart can't wait," my mother would say, in that soft, cracked voice she saved for asking. "You're the only one we can count on." I believed her. I never opened the ledger, but I had no idea how bad it was about to get. It started small, the way the worst things do. My mother began saying things. She reminds me so much of Emily at that age. "Look at those eyes, pure Emily." The first few times I let it go, kids get compared to relatives, but it kept happening. Carol bought Lily a lavender blanket, the exact shade of the comforter in Emily's Bagreet's childhood bedroom. She signed Lily up for a painting class without asking, because Emily loved to paint. One Sunday I picked Lily up, and her hair was in 2 French braids. "Grandma did my hair like her special girl," Lily told me. Climbing into the car seat, I gripped the wheel and said nothing. Then came the birthday. My parents had called the week before to say they couldn't made a cardiology follow-up that couldn't be moved. My mother said it twice, which is how I know she'd rehearsed it. The box arrived by UPS at noon. White cardboard, her handwriting on the label, and inside was the dress with the name that wasn't my daughter's. Emily, stitched into a brand new dress, sized for an 8-year-old, sent for Lily's birthday. There was a card at the bottom of the box, my mother's loopy cursive, "For our little Emily, with all our love." Our little Emily. That night, after Lily was asleep, I sent one text. Short, measured. The kind an auditor sends when she isn't ready to accuse but needs the number on the record. Mom, why does Lily's dress say Emily? She called at 8:15 the next morning. I let it ring twice, which, for me, was a revolution. Sweetheart, thank God. Her voice was already steering toward a landing she'd built overnight. It's just a name we've always loved. A family name. We thought it'd be sweet. Emily isn't a family name, Mom. It's a person. A pause. The breath before a new angle clicks in. You're reading too much into this, Myra. You always do. You take something simple and turn it into a whole Grathers. Investigation. That word. Investigation. I filed it, and then she said it. Present tense. Careless. The slip of someone who stopped guarding the door. Emily always looks best in pink. Not looked. Looks. As if my sister were still 8 years old and waiting for a dress. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. 3 days later, the money call came. It always came. My father needed an echocardiogram, my mother said. The copay alone was $400, and you know your father won't ask. For 2 years, I would have pulled up my spreadsheet, adjusted the budget on the fridge, and sent it. Instead, for the first time, I opened the insurance portal I'd been funding at $400 a month. The echocardiogram copay under that plan was $42, not $400. $42. I sat very still. If the insurance covered his heart, and I covered the mortgage, and the phone plan was active on my account, where was the rest of the money going? I opened a blank spreadsheet. The cursor blinked in cell A1. In the last 12 months alone, I had sent my parents just over $23,000, beyond the auto-pay. I pulled the county tax records, paid in full, on time. 3 years running. The money was going somewhere, just not where she said. I worked until 2 in the morning. 3 columns. What I sent. What she said it was for. What I could actually verify. The gap between the second and third columns came to $41,000 over 3,000 years. $41,000 I could not account for. I pressed my palms against my eyes. Daniel set down the bookshelf he was building. How bad? 41,000. Bad. He didn't whistle. He didn't swear. He nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he'd suspected for years and never let himself say. You need to go over there, he said. Take pictures. And Myra, he waited until I looked at him. Check that room. The one at the end of the hallway. The door that was always closed. There was a pressure behind my ribs like a fist trying to open. And I realized then, no one was coming to explain this to me gently. No one was coming to save me. I had to open the door myself. I knew their schedule. Roger had physical therapy Wednesdays at 10, and Carol always drove him. They'd be gone 90 minutes. I let myself in with the spare key under the ceramic frog that had been there since I was 9. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and something stale underneath it. I went up the stairs, past the bathroom, past the framed school photos where Emily's was large and centered, and mine was small and tucked to the side, to the door at the end of the hall. For 3 years it had been closed, sometimes locked. Once, when Lily wandered toward it at Thanksgiving, my mother intercepted her so fast she nearly knocked the child down. That's Grandma's private room, sweetheart. I put my hand on the knob. It turned. The lavender comforter was smoothed hospital tight, the yearbooks still on the desk, but the closet light was on, and the closet was full. Emily's old clothes had been shoved aside, and in their place were 4 cardboard boxes. I opened the first, folded in tissue paper, children's clothes, dresses, cardigans, Mary Jane's still in the box, sized for a girl between 6 and 10. Every single item had the same name embroidered on the collar. Emily. The tags were current. The sizes were current. Someone had been buying children's clothing in my sister's name, in my daughter's size. The third box held no clothes, just a manila folder, thick with paper. I opened it. Zelle transfer confirmations, dozens of them. Every one a payment from my parents' account to a recipient in Reno, Nevada. The name on the receiving end, Emily Brandt. The oldest receipt was dated 2 weeks after the "Don't look for me" text. The most recent was last month, and paper-clipped to the bottom, in my mother's cursive, "Don't tell Myra. She wouldn't understand." I sat on the floor of my sister's shrine and did what I do. I ran the math on my phone. 36 months of transfers. Just over $38,000. Almost exactly the gap I couldn't account for. They knew where she was. They'd always known. The grief, the locked door, the trembling phone calls about my father's dying heart. It was theater. And I was the audience of one who'd keep writing checks. I photographed every page. Then I closed the closet, walked out, and drove home without making a sound. They had no idea what was coming. My mother got there first. She always did. She called the relatives and framed it as a long overdue Sunday dinner. 12. Nothing dramatic. Just family catching up. But I'd watched her run this play before. The cast was familiar. Grandma Ruth, 86, and sharp as a letter opener. Aunt Diane, who trusted Carol's version of everything. Uncle Pete, who agreed with whoever spoke loudest. 2 cousins to fill seats and supply an audience. She wanted me outnumbered. She wanted a tribunal with me on trial. Myra abandoned her sick father over a dress. She didn't know I'd already changed the math. For 4 nights I'd worked in CPA mode. 23 pages. Bank records, Zelle confirmations, insurance claims. Every copay cross-referenced against what she'd quoted me. The variants flagged in red. Tabbed. Color-coded. I labeled the cover, *Brandt Family Reconciliation. I ironed the pink dress and folded it into a tote bag beside the file. Daniel offered to come. "Stay with Lily," I said. "I'm going prepared." I walked in carrying the bag over my shoulder. Carol met me with a hug so tight it felt like a tourniquet. "We've been so worried about you," she announced, loud enough for the room. She served pot roast. She complimented Ruth's blouse. A masterclass in normal. Right up until the cobbler hit the table and she folded her hands. "I asked everyone here because I need your help," she began, voice catching just enough to sell it. "Myra has decided to stop helping us. Your father is 67 with a heart condition, and she's cut off the support we depend on." Diane's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Myra, is that true?" "Let's talk about Emily," I said. I reached down and unzipped the bag. The room went quiet, not a polite quiet, the airless kind a table goes when it senses something is about to land. I laid the dress flat beside the cobbler, collar up so everyone could read it. Then I set the folder down and turned it toward them. "This is the dress my parents sent my daughter for her 8th birthday. The name on it is not my daughter's name. My daughter's name is Time Lily." I tapped the red column. "In 3 years, I sent them $41,000 beyond the mortgage and insurance. 38,000 of it was wired to Emily in Reno, Nevada, where she's been living the entire time my parents told me she was missing." Diane's hand went to her mouth. Ruth closed her eyes. "And they've been buying children's clothes embroidered with Emily's name, in my daughter's size, and keeping a closet full of it down the hall." Carol shot up so fast her chair hit the wall. "You had no right. You went through Emily's room. Those are her things." "Carol," Diane said quietly, staring at the dress. "Those are children's clothes. For a little girl. For when she comes back." My mother turned to the table, hunting for an ally. "She's my baby. I was keeping her place. Lily could be. Lily has Emily's eyes, Myra. You've always known that." There it was, in front of everyone. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was telling me she'd been replacing my daughter with the ghost of my sister, and she thought it was love. "Sit time down, Carol," said Ruth. And Carol sat, because Ruth was the only person alive who could make her. Then my father spoke for the first time all night. His voice cracked. I knew. I knew about the money. I knew about the clothes. I was too tired to fight. He looked at the cobbler instead of me. "I'm sorry, Myra." Diane was reading the dates on the receipts. She looked up at her sister like the floor had vanished. "You called me 3 times this week and told me she was abandoning you over a dress." Nobody touched the cobbler. I stood. The chair didn't scrape. I pushed it back slowly, the way you close a book on the last page. "I'm not going to yell," I said. "I'm going to tell you what's already done. I've canceled the mortgage auto pay. I've taken Dad off the insurance plan I was funding. I've dropped your phone lines from my account. The co-signed loan I've flagged for resolution." Carol made a sound, half gasp, half moan. "You can send Emily every dollar you earn. That's your choice. But you will not use my money to do it. And you will not rebuild her out of my child." I picked up the folder and left the dress on the table. Let them read the name. For the first time in my life, my mother had nothing to say. The calls came for 2 weeks. Pleading, then guilt, then anger, then pleading again. When the money dried up in Reno, Emily went silent too. 3 weeks, no calls, no texts, no terms. Family helps family. That told me everything I'd ever needed to know about what the word meant to my sister. A month later, the house was quieter than it had ever been. And I mean that in the best way. No phone at 7 a.m. No guilt sitting in my chest like a second breakfast. Lily started 2nd grade in a yellow dress I ordered myself. Her name is stitched inside the collar in blue thread. Lily. She ran her thumb over it before she put it on and grinned at me like it was the best thing she'd be ever owned. "It says my name," she said. "It does." I drove past my parents' house once, by accident, taking a wrong turn home from the store. The curtains were drawn. The ceramic frog was still by the door. I don't know if the door at the end of the hallway is open or closed now. It isn't mine to wonder about anymore. Cutting them off didn't make me the villain in my family's story. It made me the author of my daughter's. Some doors you walk past your whole life, until the day you realize the bravest thing you can do is stop trying to open them.